Hello. All right. I do see a comment here from Tina. Hello. So, before we get started, as always, can you guys hear me and can you see my screen as well? Hello. Hi. So, can you please confirm like if you can see my screen and if you can like hear me fine? Cool. Just wanted to confirm that. All right. So, yeah, we will be talking about Edge UI kit, which is basically a designless UI kit that I've been working on. And it's not like something revolutionary or something really different. A lot of people have built UI kits earlier. The only difference is this one is not designed. So, for example, you have like a Chakra UI in the React ecosystem, and then you have like Tailwind UI, which are like more oriented towards design. But the headless UI kit is like completely designless. So when you use the components which are shipped with this UI kit, they do not design anything for you. Instead, they kind of abstract the logic that you usually write within your templates. Now, a great example of this is headless UI. So if I go there, so headless UI is basically a React UI components library. And if you go to this one, out here, if we look at the example, you can see like this library ships with a lot of components for every single element that you will put on a page. For example, if you're creating a menu, here is a component for menu, then the button that you actually click, then the wrapper that has like all the menu items, and then there is a component for each menu item. And basically the idea is that every single element is wrapped inside a component so that you can easily design it versus having just one component which dumps a bunch of HTML to the page, and then you are like basically using the classes within that HTML to design the elements. So similar to this is Edge UI Kit. I'm not sure if we are going to have like same set of components that Headless UI have, because that is like more of a React and Vue component library, and they have like different needs. On Edge, I've started with the form controls first, because when I'm working with Edge, usually my form input, or I would say a form control, basically looks like this. So there is a label, then I have an input, then I'm like reading the old value from the flash messages, which is basically if someone submits the form and there is an error, the server will redirect and will basically send all the error messages and the form values as flash messages. So here, like I'm basically reading the old value from flash messages. Then I have a conditional, which is checking if there is an error on this particular field. If there is an error, then basically display it. And some part of this code is pretty much repetitive. For example, if I have, let's say, 8 form controls on a page, almost all of them will have like this value prop out here, which is like reading from the flash messages, and I will have like a conditional for every single input, which is like basically checking the flash messages and seeing if there is an error or not. Now, what Edge UI Kit does, it basically let you remove all this with this particular piece of code. So the form control is basically a component, and then in order to create a label, you use a component. Then for the input, you use a component, and to display the error, you also use a component. Now, since these are like individual components for every single element, you can put them anywhere inside the DOM, and you can design them as you want. They like don't come with any sort of design. So that's the basic idea behind building this UI kit. Then I've like planned on creating these inputs, and I'm also planning to create a few interactive ones as well. For example, a drop down, and then maybe tabs that you can switch over, having a alert dialog, which is like keyboard and screen reader accessible, and they all will be designless as well. So I have like done a bit of work already on this UI kit. By the way, it's not public, it's only for sponsors right now, but eventually it will be public and it will be available to everyone. And I have it working on my local. So, what I'm going to do now is I will create a new project, and then we will basically start playing with the components this library ships and see how all that actually works. And let me check where I am. Yep. So I have like already created a fresh project. That's like Edge UI Kit app. And let's run this project. All right. Here it says it works. And let's quickly go to our welcome page, get rid of all the markup we have here, and let's go to our CSS file. Also, let's get rid of all the HTML. Sorry, like all the styles in CSS we have. And out here, we will start working. So here we have a question. Will any of these components rely on JS? Yes, some of them will. We have a auto expandable text area, which basically like resize when you type inside it. That will rely on JavaScript. We also have some inputs which can auto format the value as users will type. So for example, if you have like a date input and when the user is typing the date, it will be auto formatted. And that will rely on JS. And it's not vanilla JS, it's Alpine, because Alpine allows me to basically create these components which are not relying on some sort of selectors. So like for example, before we had like Vue or React when we were in the jQuery land, if you wanted to add any sort of behavior to an element, most of the documentations recommend you to like give a certain ID or maybe a certain class to that element, and then the install plugin will basically like apply that behavior to all the elements matching that particular class, which is something I don't enjoy much. And Alpine is the opposite of that. You just like instantiate components, and you basically have like access to the element on which the component is instantiated. You don't have to like manually crawl the DOM and like select elements. So they all are going to be Alpine based. So yeah, back to the thing. So what we're gonna do is let's create a form. Method post action to, let's say, the home page, and here we will create a div, and let's start with a label for we'll call it title. This is going to be the expense title. So basically this is a form to track an expense. And then we're going to have an input, and here we say input type text, name title, ID title, and basically the same stuff. So if flash messages dot has errors dot title, let's display that particular message here. So errors dot title, and here we will say our value is flash messages dot get title, uh, oh, or an empty string. Now let's see how it looks. So here we have our input. Let's create a button as well. So here we say input type submit, and let's say create expense. Cool. So this is like the vanilla form with no CSS or anything. What we're going to do next is let's also create an endpoint which handles this form submission so that we can actually like test the situation where we have errors in our form. So I'll go to the routes file, and out here I will say route.post async, and let's pull in request from here. I will say request dot validate. Title should be, oh, we need to create a validation schema. So let's pull in that. And here we will say schema.create title schema.string. So this is like all the basic stuff that we have to do in order to validate a form. And let's have an amount schema.number, and maybe have a category which is schema.string for now. Maybe later we will change it to something else. So we will validate this form, and if it validates fine, then we will like basically return the validated data as JSON in response. Now if I come here and I submit this form, over here we get the error. It says required validation failed, which is like next to this particular field. This is how I've been writing forms, and I believe most of you have been writing forms as well. And let's say if we have to create another field, for example, for the amount, we are going to like pretty much copy this, change this to amount, change this, change this, change this, change this, and change this. Basically like changing the name of the field and the ID almost everywhere. And if I submit again, we have like 2 errors. Now what Edge UI Kit does, it basically helps me get rid of all this and just use the components. So what I'm going to do, I will install the library. So I will say npmi. It's on my local right now. It's not published on npm yet, but I will install it. Once that's done, what I will do is I will create a preload file, prld file called view. Basically, I will use this file to use the UI kit as a plugin on the template engine. That's Edge. So let's first import the template engine. That's view. Next, import the UI kit from Edge UI kit and say view.use Edge UI kit. This is pretty much all you have to do on the Adonis.js side, like on the server end, to use the UI kit. And once you do that, you basically have all the access to all the components that this package basically ships. So what we're gonna do is, let's say UI.form.control. So this is like basically the form control that we are creating. And we will specify the name on the control itself. So I will say title. And then for this particular label, we will use UI.form.label, and it will have a text of expense title. Let's get rid of this. And for the input, we will say UI.form.input. And we don't have to like specify anything. And for the error message, we will say UI.form.error. That's pretty much all. And now we can basically get rid of all the HTML we wrote earlier. Now save it and let's test it inside our browser. And so here's basically the label and the input. So this form control does not output any DOM element or any HTML element. It basically creates a scope which the child components can access, which are like these components. Now, for example, we define the name on just the control, but the label, the input, and error all are able to access this name. So if we go back to the browser, here you can see the label says label for title, and the input says the name is title, the ID is title. And we have not defined those on these individual components. They are like basically able to access it directly from its parent component. Now, uh, this idea I think is called like props drilling or something like that, which I borrowed from Svelte. Let's see if I can find it. So if I say Svelte, and I think in their tutorial, they component bindings. I think these, yeah. So it's basically known as the context API in Svelte, and I think Vue also have it. I'm not sure about React how they handle it. So if you look at something here, yeah. And if you go to this particular one, I'm just trying to make sense of how exactly their API works. And if I won't be able to do that, then most probably I may move to Vue. So basically, like they have this parent component, that's the map, which will like share some context, which can share some context with the yeah. So I think it's basically exporting some variables. Yeah, so it's exporting these three variables, which I think you can access from here. Yeah, here they have like some comment, get the context here. Let's check Vue context API, if that makes more sense. Oh, no. Yeah, again, I think like Vue has changed a lot, and I think the folks who have been like using Vue, maybe they can say. But like basically the idea is instead of passing in props manually, these front end frameworks came up with a way that you can basically expose these props from a parent component, and child can access it. So in case of Edge, if I come here and I say inspect dollar context, you can see this object has been like uh, dumped to the page, which basically has like some properties like is wrapped in control, what is the name of the control, what is the ID, what are the errors, if there is any error or not, and what's the old value. And basically, this statement is also a child of this component, similar to the label and the input. So if you can access the name that you have defined on the control out here, the label can also access it, input can also access it, and error can also access it. For example, if you say $context dot name, here it says title. Yeah, maybe I was checking the wrong thing. I like added this feature a very long time back. At that point in time, I was reading about Vue and Svelte. But anyways, the idea was you have a parent component which can create a scope for all the children, and they can access that scope versus you defining all the props every single time to all the children components. So that's the basic idea. Now let's copy this and paste it here. This time we will say amount, enter amount, and we don't have to change anything. That's pretty much all. So let's get rid of this as well and put it here. And if we submit the form, we again get the errors. And again, like all the error handling is done by this particular component. Now, if you want to display the error in some specific way, you can remove this exclamation mark, which basically means it's a self-closed component, and basically handle the error here. So what you can do, let's say you have a P, and you can say context dot errors. So here, and you can see now it's wrapped inside a P. That's the reason it's coming in a new line. And also, if you notice one more thing, when there is an error, these components are basically adding a few additional ARIA attributes to help the screen reader announce the error to the person who's like basically using the screen reader. So here it says ARIA invalid true, described by this particular span, which has the error inside it. And if you don't want this tag to be span, you can basically say as div like this. And now if we submit again, now it's not a span anymore, it's a div. Also, like you can pass any props from here. For example, you can say class error. Let's call it like error. And if we come to our CSS, we can say class error, color red. And if we submit, oh, sorry, there is a typo here. Yep, now our error message is in red. And not only the class, you can like pretty much pass in any prop you want, and it will be added to the actual element, which is in the DOM right now. Now, if you look at it, it's not like something, as I said, like revolutionary or something like really different, but it's a very small thing which cleans up all of your forms a lot. You don't have to like manually pull the values from the flash messages. You don't have to write conditionals to show the error or not to show the error. Do we need to install Alpine JS separately for the UI kit? Yes, you have to. So basically, the UI kit front end components or plugins does not come with Alpine. So you basically install it inside your project, and then when you use the plugin, you use it on a specific instance of Alpine that you have already installed, and we will go through it in a while. So that's the other thing. Now, in fact, let's play with that. So what I'm going to do here is I will say, before defining this, let's set up our JS. So what I'm going to do, I will say npm id Alpine.js. All right, that's done. Let's import Alpine from Alpine.js, and then let's import @UIKit /inputs. And the one we need is numeral input. And we will talk about it, like how all this works. But let's first set it up. Alpine.plugin numeral. I think it's numeral input. And here we can say alpine.start. Yep, that's how you will do it. So basically, you can say input type and password, email, like all the input types that you usually define on an input element. So like the UI kit does not introduce any sort of new props except where it's required. Apart from that, all the props that you can define on an HTML element will be basically are like basically supported. So again, let's go back here and let's talk about it. So we install Alpine, and then we import the specific input type, or like the plugin that we want to use. We register the plugin, and then we call like Alpine.start. That's the method you have to call in order to use Alpine. Now, once you have defined this numeral plugin out here, you can define formats on your inputs as well. So if we come here, since this is an amount, so we can say the format should be numeral. And if we come here, and if I try to, let's see. Oh, sorry, I put it on the label, should be on the input. My bad. If you look at the DOM, yep. So now you can see that our input is basically wrapped inside a span, which is instantiating basically an Alpine component. And if I try to type anything which is not a number, it does not allow me to do that. And if I type number, it basically auto formats them for me. Now, for auto formatting, I'm using this library called Cleave.js. So this is the library that I'm using in order to auto format all the inputs. So if we come to this one, and let's say if you want to change the style of formatting to the lac one, so we can copy this and we can come here and we can define the value. And now when we will type, our numbers will be formatted in a specific way. And again, like you don't have to like specify any specific IDs or classes to your inputs, and then go to your JavaScript and say, okay, like change all the inputs which have this particular class and auto format them. You don't have to do that. You're basically just installing the plugin once out here, and now you can create as many inputs as you want. Just define the format, and if you don't want to use it, you just remove it, and you don't have to like clean up any JavaScript after that. So this is how like the auto formatting works. We have one more, that's the text area, which can basically auto resize when you type. So here we can say description and say expense description. This will be a text area. And here we can say, let's first leave it like this. And now if we type, you see we get a scroll bar, and it doesn't like auto resize. So again, the same idea, we will import a plugin called auto resize text area and install that plugin, basically register it with Alpine, go back here and say auto resize true. And now if I type, you can see it like auto resizes. And again, we don't have any like custom selectors or anything. As soon as this particular thing is removed from the DOM, you don't have to like clean up any JavaScript for that from your code base. So yeah, that's the basic idea behind these components. Of course, like once it will be released, there will be documentation around it. So it's like easier for you to know which components are available. And one more thing we can play with. So I do have a plan to create a few interactive components as well. For example, like a modal box to show some alert message, which will be keyboard and screen reader accessible. Have a component to, let's say, display a drop down, again, something that you can control via keyboard. And I've already created one for tabs, and maybe we can try that one out. So what I'm gonna do is let's comment all this out and work with the tabs one. So I think it's ui.tabs.grip, and here we will say ui.tabs.list, and here we're gonna say ui.tabs.trigger, and I will say text tab 1. Let's create 3. These all are self-closed, so tab 2, tab 3, and let's create a div here, and we will say these are the panels, and let's uh, remove all this from here. And these are not self-closed because usually the panels will have like a lot of HTML. So here we say content for tab 1, and here we're gonna say and p content for tab 2, and here we will say p content for tab 3. Again, we will have to register our Alpine plugin as well. So let's do that here. I think it's an import from Edge UI kit slash tabs, if I'm not wrong. And here I can say Alpine dot plugin tabs. All right, let's see if it works. Yep. So I can click on it and you can see it like switching the tabs. I can use my keyboard. It's doing that. And I can use, like home and the end buttons, and it basically moves between the first and the last one. And again, it's like designless. You can design all the elements by yourself. For example, this particular component creates this tab container. The list creates this particular div, and each trigger creates a button. Out here, each panel basically creates a div, and then it has some attributes on it, which is required to make everything keyboard and screen reader accessible. Can we change the component tag names? Uh, I didn't get it. You mean like what's output in the HTML versus, or do you mean the actual component names? All right, so let's see what else can we talk about. One thing is how can you actually style these triggers based upon which one is selected. So uh, all right, so let me answer a few questions first. So, like div span, yep, you can do that where it makes sense. For example, for triggers, no, you cannot, because in order to create an accessible component, you have to create a button. Yes, you can replace it with a div, but then you have to define like additional roles on it to make it behave like a button. But for example, for this particular one, if you don't want it to be a div, you want it to be a span, you can say as span. And if I'm not wrong, it should work. Uh, nope, not in this particular case, but ideally it should work. So you can basically say as span, then instead of outputting the div, it will output span. That's basically the idea behind all the components. All right, now we have another question. How complicated will it be to make the form control a one-liner? Example, name, description, type, input, label, awesome label, error. Yeah, but what happens with that is if you like define all the props to one element, to one component, then that component becomes responsible for outputting multiple HTML elements. Then you cannot design them. For example, the code you shared, in that case, the form control will be basically creating the label as well as the input. Now, you cannot control which classes will end up on the label, which classes will end up on the input, and then you basically have to like come up with some really complex JSON API which allows you to design all these multiple elements, and then it becomes really complex. Also, another important thing is uh, ideally you will not be like copy pasting these components everywhere inside your app. You will basically, let's say if you are working on a system, you already have like some design in place, you will create one designed component out of this, and then you will use that everywhere else. So basically, you will have like multiple layers. The first one is the UI kit layer, which basically abstracts all the logic and repetitive markup from your code. And then you have a layer on top of that, which makes design decisions as well based upon the design system, or like any style guide you are following. So usually you won't be using them directly. You will wrap them inside another layer of components. And that's how I've like pretty much seen everyone doing it if they are using Headless UI. The another popular one is Redux UI in the React ecosystem. So they also give a lot of designless components that people usually wrap and create their own styled libraries out of it. Yep. So those were the questions. Now let's see how we can actually change the classes that get applied to these buttons when a tab is changed. Now, since when the tabs are getting changed, all of that stuff is happening like in the front end. And any logic that you write to switch the classes have to be in the front end as well, because like not every tab change will trigger a backend request and return new HTML. So the most easiest and the simplest way to do that is to keep all that logic within your front end JavaScript code versus keeping it here. So what you can do is you can wrap this entire tabs group inside a custom Alpine component, which will live inside your app. So we can like, let's say call it tabs wrapper. And here you can say alpine.data tabs wrapper. And over here you can return trigger. So I'm just like typing out the entire code, and then we will talk about it. Xbind class, which is a function, return. And then we, let's say, want to give it a class of selected. Otherwise, we don't want to give it any class. And come back to our trigger. Here we can say xbind trigger. Let's copy it a couple of times, and here as well. Now, yeah, so the first tab is selected. You can see it has a selected class. If I select the second one, you can see the class gets removed from there. The class gets added to the second one. Again, if I select the third one, that is what happens. Now, let's say we change the color to have some visual cue. So we say selected color to purple. Oh, that's not even visible. Blue. Yeah, that's visible. So now let me explain how all this is basically working. Very first, the idea is not to keep any sort of front-end logic within your Edge templates and move that to JavaScript and allow you to handle that. using the Alpine components. For example, in this case, you wrap the entire group with a custom Alpine component. And out here, you create that component. And here you say that I have a trigger. Now, all this is like documented in the Alpine docs. So let's go there. And if you go to xbind, yeah. So here they say instead of like putting individual attributes on your element, for example, in this case, instead of writing xref trigger and then like at the rate click this dot open, you say xbind and then you give it an object. Then all of these props will basically end up on the element. Similarly, when they have a dialog, instead of typing x show and saying like click dot outside, you move all of that attributes to the JavaScript and you just say xbind. This is what we are doing out here. So we say it's a trigger, and then we are saying every time this.el is basically the reference to the element on which you're saying xbind trigger. So in this case, this.el refers to this specific button. In this case, this.el is this specific button, and so on. So if you want to check, we can say console.log this.el. And let's refresh. Yep, you can see this button, this button, this button. And if we switch again, every individual button checks. If it's selected, then it returns the set of classes for itself. And this particular method called this.isSelected is available to you because this xbind is wrapped inside a tabs group, which is a component itself. So in Alpine, if you have a tree of components, the child at any specific level can access the attributes of a parent, and that is what is happening right now. So this tabs group instantiates an Alpine component which has this method called xSelected, is selected, which you can access over here. Now, this all may feel a bit complex because there are so many moving parts. If you're not too familiar with Alpine, then this entire syntax like xbind and then defining an object out here can be complicated as well. But usually it's going to be pretty much copy paste. So you say xbind, and now you can basically define the attributes you want to end up on the HTML element that is selected. And it can be a class, it can be any specific attribute like hidden, checked, selected, whatever you want. So yeah, that's how you can basically control the styling or any other attributes which are getting added at the runtime within the front end code base. Not sure how complex all this is, but usually I think with proper documentation and having a bit of idea and understanding about Alpine can make things a bit easier for you. So yeah, that pretty much I would say is all. Again, the entire UI kit is is not ready right now. I'm already working on it. I had some components working fine, and some have a bit of issues as well. But the idea is to have this one set of components which does not come with any sort of design decisions, and make certain things easier for you, so that you can pretty much copy paste them and work on your apps. And in terms of the interactive components, like this tabs one, we're going to have few. Basically, the ones I need right now, I will be adding them because it can be really time consuming to build some really good, fully accessible front end custom components. So I will only build the ones that I usually need, and then maybe someone else can contribute the others. So yeah, uh, I think that's pretty much all. It was a short session, and if you have any questions, you can ask them. Cool. If there are no questions from anyone, I'll just end this stream now. And once the UI kit will be public, of course, I will let you know. All right, folks. See ya. Goodbye.